It started with a bark. Not the playful yap of a dog chasing a tennis ball, not the warning growl of a mutt behind a picket fence. This was different, deep, sharp, insistent. A bark that made the air shift in the hallways of Maplewood Preparatory Academy, a school that prided itself on perfection. For a moment, all the polished marble floors, gold-trimmed banners, and framed portraits of smiling alumni couldn't mask what that bark meant. Something was wrong. Shadow, a black and tan German shepherd with a soldier's bearing, stood rigid in front of a locked faculty room at the far end of the East Wing. His ears were pricked forward, his teeth bared, and his stance low, tail stiff. To the students gathered for the campus safety demonstration, it almost looked like a performance. They giggled, nudged each other, whispered about how cool the police dog was. But Officer Daniel Ross knew better. Ross had been partnered with Shadow for 5 years. In that time, he'd learned that his dog's instincts never lied. Drugs, explosives, fugitives. Shadow always found what was hidden. Now, on a sunny fall morning in Connecticut, in a place that catered to the wealthiest families on the East Coast, Shadow was barking like he'd just picked up the scent of danger. "Easy, boy," Ross murmured, tightening his grip on the leash. His voice was calm, but his gut was uneasy. Parents stood in clusters, sipping lattes from paper cups, dressed in sharp suits and designer jackets. Principal Carter, tall and silver-haired, glided toward Ross with a smile that belonged on a politician's campaign poster. "Officer Ross," Carter said smoothly, "thank you for bringing Shadow today. He's quite spirited." "He's alerting to something where," Ross replied. "That room locked?" Carter's smile tightened. "It's part of the East Wing, closed for renovations. Storage mostly. Old desks, broken projectors, nothing exciting. The children don't need to worry about a barking dog, now do they?" The parents chuckled politely, and a ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. A mother in pearls whispered, "Maybe he smells the cafeteria food." A father with a Rolex added, "Or my teenager's cologne smells lethal enough." Ross didn't laugh. Shadow wasn't the type to bark at smells of pizza or cheap perfume. He was a canine with a nose for chemicals, for adrenaline, for fear. The demonstration ended, applause echoing across the gym-bright hallway. Students returned to class, chatter buzzing. Parents filed out, reassured that Maplewood Prep, with its manicured lawns and iron gates, was safe. Only Ross lingered, tugging gently on Shadow's leash, trying to lead him away. But the dog planted his paws, staring at the locked faculty door, barking once more, lower, angrier. That night, long after the laughter had faded, Ross couldn't shake the image. He was back home in his modest ranch-style house, sitting on the couch in sweats, a cold beer sweating on the coffee table. Shadow lay on the rug, but every so often he'd sit up and let out a low whine, eyes fixed toward the east, toward Maplewood. Ross rubbed the bridge of his nose. "You can't let it go, can you?" he asked softly. Shadow's tail thumped once, twice, as if to say no. Ross had been a cop for nearly 20 years. He'd seen enough tragedies to know that the moments people brushed off, the uneasy feeling, the dismissed warning, were the ones that came back to haunt you. He thought of the missing kids he'd searched for over the years, the families left shattered. He leaned forward and scratched behind Shadow's ear. "All right, boy, tomorrow we'll go back." The next day, the school was its usual picture of prestige. SUVs lined the Circle Drive, dropping off students in pressed blazers and plaid skirts. Groundskeepers trimmed hedges so precise they looked measured with rulers. The smell of autumn leaves mixed with leather briefcases and cologne. Inside, the East Wing was quieter than the rest of the campus. The walls were lined with old photographs, founders in stiff suits, students in black and white uniforms. At the end of the hall, the locked faculty room stood plain and unremarkable. A brass doorknob, chipped paint, a chain across the handle. The moment they turned the corner, Shadow stiffened. His ears shot up, his body lowered. A growl rumbled in his chest, deep as a drum. Ross slowed his steps. "You're on it again, huh?" Shadow lunged forward, straining against the leash, barking sharp and furious. His paws clawed the polished floor, nails clicking. Ross braced his stance, pulled back gently but firmly. "Shadow, heel!" But Shadow wouldn't heel. He barked and pawed, nose pressed to the seam of the locked door. His whole body vibrated with urgency. Ross bent close, pressing his hand against the wood. That faint, sweet chemical odor. He smelled it again. Barely there, but enough. He frowned, stepped back, glanced around. Students hurried past laughing, heads down in their phones. Teachers carried stacks of papers. No one noticed, no one cared. No one except the dog. Ross approached Principal Carter after class. That east wing door, I need to look inside. Carter sighed, his smile strained. Officer Ross, with all respect, there's nothing to see. That space hasn't been touched in years. Then there won't be any harm in me checking it, Ross countered. But Carter's voice hardened, steel behind the polish. We value privacy here. The donors and trustees wouldn't appreciate a police search disrupting the school day. I trust you understand. Ross did understand. Understood that Maplewood's reputation mattered more than truth. He looked down at Shadow, who sat at his side, chest rising fast, eyes fixed on Carter. The dog didn't trust the principal one bit. That evening, Ross stood in his kitchen, the weight of the day pressing on him. He pulled a leftover slice of pizza from the fridge, tossed Shadow a bite of crust, but the dog didn't touch it. Instead, he paced by the door, whining, scratching at the wood, restless. You're telling me something, Ross muttered, but I need more than barks. He thought about the parents with their pearls and Rolexes, about the polished speeches and the laughter. Maplewood had layers, like the expensive gloss on its walls, surface beauty covering cracks beneath. And Shadow had found one of those cracks. Halfway through his restless night, Ross sat down at his desk, staring at case files stacked in neat piles. He wasn't officially on a case here. Maplewood had only asked for a demo. But Shadow didn't know off-duty. To a K9, every scent, every sound was evidence. Ross pulled out his phone, typed a few notes. He'd need to check school records, see what was really in that east wing. Renovations? Storage? Or something else entirely? Shadow nudged his leg, eyes intense. Ross exhaled. We'll dig, partner, one step at a time. And if you're still following this story right now, here's something important. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss where this is heading. It's about to get darker, and you'll want to see every piece of the truth as it comes out. The next morning, Ross returned to Maplewood under the pretense of routine patrol. He made casual conversation with the staff. Some brushed him off. Others looked nervous when he mentioned the East Wing. One teacher laughed too quickly. Oh, nobody goes down there. Place is full of dust and spiders. But Shadow wasn't deterred. Once again, the moment they passed the locked room, his hackles rose. He pawed furiously, barking, the sound echoing down the marble hall. A few students paused, their faces paling. A boy whispered, "That's where Charlotte was last seen before class." His friend elbowed him to shut up. Ross froze. Charlotte Hale, a sophomore. Bright, top of her class, from one of the wealthiest families in town. He hadn't heard that she was missing, because officially she wasn't. He crouched beside Shadow, looking the dog square in the eye. "Good boy, keep talking to me." Ross straightened, his pulse quickening. Something inside that locked room was calling to Shadow again and again. And now, for the first time, Ross had a human lead to go with it. The perfect facade of Maplewood Prep was beginning to crack. The rumor started as a whisper, the kind of half-truth that spreads between students faster than wildfire on dry brush. By Monday morning, everyone at Maplewood Prep seemed to know that Officer Ross's K9 had gone ballistic outside the locked faculty room in the East Wing. To the students, it was thrilling gossip. To the teachers, it was an annoyance. But to Ross, it was a warning he couldn't afford to ignore. Shadow had never acted that way without reason. Ross pulled into the circular drive of the school that morning, his cruiser blending in poorly with the shiny Teslas, BMWs, and Range Rovers lined up in the parent drop-off zone. Teenagers in plaid skirts and navy blazers poured out of cars, earbuds in, coffee tumblers clutched like lifelines. Parents waved briskly before disappearing back into the traffic flow, some without so much as a glance behind them. Shadow sat tall in the back seat, ears twitching, watching the scene with laser focus. "You feel it, don't you?" Ross muttered as he parked. The dog gave a short whine and pressed his nose to the window. Inside, the school bustled with the energy of a new week. Students hustled to classes, teachers barked reminders, and the smell of polished wood mixed with the faint scent of cafeteria breakfast. Ross moved through the hallways with practiced ease, Shadow at his side. He wasn't officially on duty here, not exactly, but Principal Carter had begrudgingly allowed him to observe for a few days under the guise of community engagement. Ross knew the truth. Carter just wanted to make sure the police presence didn't attract too much attention. Reputation was everything at Maplewood Prep. They passed the main office, where a receptionist with a tight smile pretended not to notice them. Ross tipped his chin politely but didn't slow down. His destination was clear: the East Wing. As they approached, Shadow's entire body shifted. His ears pricked forward, tail stiffened, steps quickened. By the time they reached the locked faculty room, the dog was already pulling hard on the leash, nails scraping the floor. Ross braced, crouched down, and whispered, "What is it, boy?" Shadow pressed his nose against the seam of the door, breathing fast, whining now in between sharp barks. His paw scratched the wood, desperate, urgent. Ross leaned in. There it was again, the faint, sweet chemical odor. Not overpowering, but unmistakable. Something was seeping out from behind that door. He glanced over his shoulder. A pair of students had slowed their steps, watching wide-eyed. One of them whispered, "That's where Charlotte was." Ross straightened. "What did you say?" The boy froze, eyes darting to his friend. She tugged his arm, whispering, "Don't. Just go." They hurried off before Ross could press further. Charlotte. The name echoed in his mind. He hadn't seen her file, hadn't been told officially she was missing, but something in the way those kids spoke told him all he needed to know. The school was covering it up. He tugged Shadow back gently. "We're not done here, partner. Not even close." At lunch, Ross sat with a few faculty members in the staff lounge. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and reheated leftovers. A vending machine hummed in the corner, and the walls were lined with motivational posters that looked as if they hadn't been replaced in 20 years. "So," Ross said casually, leaning back, "what's the deal with the East Wing?" A history teacher, Mr. Dalton, chuckled nervously. "Storage, mostly. Broken desks, filing cabinets. Place is a dump." "Funny," Ross said. "Shadow doesn't think so. He's locked on that door every time we walk by." The room grew quieter. A math teacher pushed her salad around with a fork, not meeting his eyes. "Dogs can be dramatic," another offered. "Maybe he smells mold. That wing's got leaks. You know how dogs are." Ross smiled thinly but said nothing. He recognized the signs. People who knew more than they were willing to admit. When he left the lounge, Shadow brushed against his leg, impatient. Ross crouched, rubbing the dog's neck. "We'll get to the bottom of it. Just give me time." That evening, Ross returned to the school under the pretense of picking up forgotten paperwork. The building was quieter after hours, hallways dimly lit, footsteps echoing against the tile. Shadow padded beside him, body tense. They passed trophy cases gleaming in the soft light. Decades of championships in debate, rowing, fencing. Maplewood wasn't just a school. It was a factory for prestige. Every inch of the place was designed to scream excellence. But the East Wing was different. The air felt heavier, colder. Shadow stopped dead at the locked room, barking once, sharp and decisive. Ross knelt, pressing his ear against the door. Nothing. Silence. But the smell was stronger now. Chemical, sweet, cloying. He pulled a small flashlight from his belt, flicked it on, and scanned the frame. The lock was old. Brass tarnished, paint chipped. A faint scuff mark marred the floor where the door met the threshold, like it had been opened recently despite Carter's claims. "Somebody's been in here," Ross whispered. Shadow growled, low and steady, nose pressed against the wood. Ross stood quickly as footsteps echoed down the hall. A flashlight beam swept across the floor. "Officer Ross?" Principal Carter's voice carried, smooth but sharp. He appeared from the shadows, polished as always, though his eyes glittered with something harder than charm. "What brings you to this side of campus after hours?" Ross slid the flashlight into his pocket. "Checking the building. My partner here can't seem to leave this door alone." Carter's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Dogs get fixated. It's nothing. I told you before. Storage. You're chasing shadows." Ross met his gaze evenly. "Funny thing about shadows. They usually mean something standing in the light." For a second, the tension was thick enough to cut. Then Carter's smile widened, and he stepped aside. "Have a good night, officer." Ross walked away, Shadow reluctantly following, but his mind was racing. Something was inside that room. Something Carter didn't want anyone to see. Back home, Ross sat at his kitchen table, case notes spread before him. Shadow paced restlessly, circling, whining, finally sitting by the door as if waiting for orders. Ross sighed, running a hand through his hair. You won't let this go, huh? The dog's stare was unrelenting. Ross picked up his pen, jotting down everything. The chemical odor, the scuff marks, the whispers about Charlotte. He didn't have enough to request a warrant yet, but he had enough to trust his gut and Shadow's instincts. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. This wasn't just about a locked door. This was about a school that valued its image over its students. And if Charlotte was missing, that locked room might be the key. 2 days later, during morning patrol, Shadow froze in the hallway. Ross followed his gaze. Down the corridor, Mr. Grayson, the literature teacher, strode past with a stack of books. He was tall, immaculately dressed, his tie perfectly knotted, his smile disarming. Students greeted him warmly, their faces lighting up at his presence. But Shadow's reaction was immediate. Ears back, lips curled, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Ross tightened the leash. Easy, boy. Grayson paused, chuckling. Guess your partner doesn't like me much. Or maybe he knows something I don't, Ross replied evenly. For a flicker of a second, something shifted in Grayson's eyes. A flash of annoyance quickly masked by his usual charm. He smiled. Dogs can be funny that way. As he walked off, Shadow barked once, sharp and loud, echoing down the hallway. Students turned their heads. Teachers frowned. Principal Carter appeared moments later, irritation etched on his face. Control your animal, Officer Ross, Carter snapped quietly. This school doesn't need drama. Ross's jaw tightened. Then maybe open the door and prove there's nothing inside. Carter's eyes narrowed. That's not your call. Ross didn't reply, but Shadow did. By barking again, louder this time, as if to say the truth was behind that locked door and no amount of polish or reputation could bury it forever. By Wednesday morning, the buzz around Maplewood Prep had shifted. The chatter about the barking police dog had given way to something quieter, heavier, more urgent. Students whispered in corners. Teachers' voices lowered when they thought no one was listening. Something was wrong, and Ross could feel it in the air before anyone said a word. He'd parked his cruiser just after dawn, sipping burnt gas station coffee while Shadow sat in the back seat. Nose pressed to the window, eyes locked on the looming brick facade of the school. The campus was still beautiful, ivy climbing up the walls, flags fluttering in the crisp fall breeze. But the veneer felt thinner now, fragile. Ross checked his phone. No official alerts, no missing person bulletins, no calls from the local precinct. Yet he knew. Dogs didn't lie, and neither did the silence that hung over the place. Classes hadn't yet started when Ross walked inside, Shadow padding beside him. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and teenage sweat, but under it all lingered that same sweet chemical note that Shadow picked up every time they passed the east wing. Shadow tensed, ears forward, and pulled hard on the leash toward the locked faculty room. He barked once, then twice, sharp and angry. Ross crouched low. Easy, partner, we'll get there. A group of students lingered nearby, whispering. Ross caught snippets of their conversation. She didn't text me back last night. Her mom's freaking out. What if she really ran away? Ross stood, his gaze steady. Who's missing? The students froze, wide-eyed. A boy in a navy blazer stammered. We weren't, it's nothing, sir. Shadow barked, startling them. The boy flinched. Ross's voice was calm but firm. Tell me. A girl finally spoke up, her voice trembling. Charlotte Hale. She wasn't in homeroom yesterday. She never came back to the dorms. People said maybe she left on her own. Ross's chest tightened. Charlotte. The name he'd heard whispered days ago. Did the school report it? He asked. The kids glanced at each other, then shook their heads. Principal Carter said her family knows, the girl whispered. He said it's private. Private. Ross almost laughed, except nothing about this was funny. At any other school, a missing student would mean police cars, helicopters, Amber Alerts. But at Maplewood Prep, appearances mattered more than truth. He nodded once. Thanks. The kids scurried off, eyes darting nervously over their shoulders. Ross looked down at Shadow. The dog growled low and steady, nose pressed to the locked door again. Yeah, Ross muttered. I don't like it either. Later that morning, Ross tracked down Principal Carter in his office. The room was as polished as the man himself. Mahogany desk, framed diplomas, a wall of golf trophies. Carter looked up with a politician's smile. Officer Ross, to what do I owe the pleasure? Ross didn't sit. Charlotte Hale is missing. Carter's smile faltered only slightly. She's taken a leave. Family matters. You know how these things are. Ross leaned forward, planting his hands on the desk. What I know is that your students are whispering. What I know is that my dog has been alerting at that East Wing door for days. And what I know is that a 15-year-old girl doesn't just vanish without someone noticing. Carter's eyes hardened. Officer Ross, this is not your jurisdiction. Maplewood handles its own matters. The Hale family has been notified. They've chosen to keep this private. Ross straightened slowly. With respect, Principal, privacy doesn't apply to missing children. For a long moment, the two men locked eyes. Carter's jaw worked. Finally, he said, "Trust me, officer. Everything is under control." Ross turned and walked out. But Shadow stopped at the threshold, turned back, and barked once at Carter. Loud, sharp, defiant. The principal flinched. By afternoon, Ross positioned himself in the East Wing again, keeping a low profile. Students shuffled by, whispering. A janitor pushed a mop bucket down the hall, avoiding Ross's eyes. Shadow sniffed along the doorframe of the locked faculty room, then froze, ears tilting. Ross crouched. "What is it?" Shadow pawed at the base of the door, nails scraping the tile. Then his nose darted to the side, sniffing along the wall until he pressed against a heating vent. His growl deepened. Ross pulled a pen light from his pocket, shined it inside. Nothing visible, just dust and cobwebs. But the dog wouldn't stop, pressing harder, whining. Ross slipped a gloved hand through the vent and brushed the inside edge. Something soft snagged against his fingers. He pulled it out. A ribbon, navy blue with a small gold emblem stitched at the edge. The same emblem embroidered on every Maplewood prep uniform. Ross held it up to the light. Charlotte's ribbon. Shadow barked furiously, the sound echoing through the empty hall. Ross's stomach dropped. That night, Ross drove to the Hale estate, a sprawling colonial on the edge of town. The gates were tall, the lawn immaculate. A uniformed guard stopped him at the drive. "Family's not taking visitors," the guard said stiffly. "Tell them Officer Ross is here," Ross replied. "It's about their daughter." Minutes later, he was ushered inside. The house smelled of polished wood and expensive perfume. Mrs. Hale sat on a leather sofa, eyes red-rimmed, clutching a silk handkerchief. Mr. Hale stood stiffly by the fireplace, jaw clenched, a glass of scotch in hand. Ross removed his hat. "I heard Charlotte's missing." Mrs. Hale's voice cracked. "She's not missing. She just needed space. That's what Principal Carter told us. She'll come back." Ross studied her trembling hands. She didn't believe a word she was saying. Mr. Hale spoke firmly. "The school has assured us this is being handled. Discretion is important. We don't want media circus." Ross's voice sharpened. "Sir, your daughter hasn't been seen in 2 days. That's not a leave of absence. That's a disappearance. You need to let us investigate." Mr. Hale's grip on his glass tightened. "We trust Maplewood. This isn't your concern." Ross swallowed his frustration. He knew a brick wall when he hit one. Money, power, reputation. At places like this, they silence the truth. But Shadow wasn't interested in money or prestige. He was interested in scent. And the scent told him Charlotte hadn't gone anywhere willingly. The next morning, Ross stood in the East Wing again. Shadow pressed against the locked door, barking low and furious. A few students lingered nearby, their faces pale. One of them, a quiet boy with messy blonde hair, stepped forward. She was supposed to meet Mr. Grayson after school. Everyone knows. He said he was helping her with an essay. Ross's head snapped toward him. "Grayson?" The boy nodded nervously. "Yeah, she told her roommate. That's the last anyone heard." Shadow barked sharply as if confirming it. Ross's pulse quickened. Grayson, the teacher everyone adored. The man Shadow had growled at days ago. He crouched beside the dog, voice low. "You were right, partner. You've been right all along." Shadow's gaze never left the locked door. His body quivered with tension, ears sharp, barking again, demanding someone finally listen. And Ross knew in his gut, Charlotte Hale wasn't missing by accident. She was behind that door, or had been, and someone at Maplewood Prep was doing everything they could to keep it hidden. Mr. Grayson had the kind of presence that made people stop in their tracks. Parents loved him, Students adored him, and the administration leaned on him as their shining example of Maplewood's excellence. He was the kind of teacher alumni remembered fondly in college essays and reunions. Tall, broad-shouldered, early 40s, with neatly combed dark hair and an easy smile. He looked more like a senator than a high school teacher. To outsiders, he was the pride of the school. To Shadow, he was something else entirely. It happened on a crisp Thursday morning. Students crowded the hallway between classes, chatter bouncing off the polished walls. Grayson emerged from his classroom with a stack of books under one arm, pausing to clap a boy on the shoulder and offer encouragement. "Good work on that paper, Jacob. Keep it up." The boy grinned, shoulders squaring with pride. A girl passed and blushed when Grayson smiled at her. He had that effect. Charming, confident, disarming. Then Shadow froze. The German shepherd's ears pinned back, his stance lowered, and a low, steady growl rolled from his chest. Before Ross could react, Shadow barked, sharp and vicious, lunging toward Grayson with such force the leash burned Ross's palm. The hallway went silent. Dozens of students turned to stare. Grayson stopped mid-step, eyebrows raised. "Easy there," he said, his voice smooth, though his eyes flickered with something colder. "What's this about?" Ross yanked back on the leash, planting his feet. "Shadow, heel!" The dog strained forward, teeth bared, unrelenting. "Apologies," Ross said tightly. "He doesn't usually react like this." Grayson chuckled softly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe he smells the cafeteria food on me. Those cheeseburgers can't be good for anyone." Students laughed nervously. A teacher poked her head out of her classroom, frowning. "Is everything okay?" Ross forced a smile. "We're fine, just a little too much energy." But he wasn't fine, and Shadow wasn't just energized. He was alerting, hard, to something, to someone. After the bell rang and the hallway emptied, Ross knelt beside Shadow. The dog's chest heaved, eyes locked in the direction Grayson had gone. "You've never done that before," Ross murmured. "Not without reason." He scratched behind Shadow's ear, grounding them both. His gut churned. First the locked room, now the adored teacher. The pieces weren't fitting neatly, but they were fitting. That afternoon, Ross visited the library. Students huddled at long wooden tables, laptops open, heads bent over books. He approached a quiet girl near the back, Charlotte Hale's roommate. She jumped when he spoke. "Relax," Ross said gently. "I'm not here to get you in trouble. I just need to ask about Charlotte." The girl bit her lip, eyes darting around. "We're not supposed to talk about it." "I know," Ross said, lowering his voice. "But she's missing, and every day counts. Please." Tears welled in her eyes. "She said she had a meeting with Mr. Grayson. She was nervous about it. Said he wanted to go over her essay after class." Ross kept his voice calm. "When was this?" "Monday," the girl whispered. "She never came back." Ross's jaw tightened. "Did you tell anyone?" She nodded quickly. "The dean. But he said she probably went home early. Then Principal Carter told me not to spread rumors." Ross exhaled slowly. "You did the right thing by telling me." Shadow sat close, head on the girl's knee. She stroked his fur absently, comforted by the solid presence. That evening, Ross couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk, papers spread out, Shadow lying at his feet but restless. His notes circled around the same points: the locked East Wing room, the chemical odor, Charlotte's ribbon, Shadow's reaction to Grayson. Ross had been a cop long enough to know patterns. On paper, Grayson looked clean. 10 years of glowing evaluations, a line of grateful students, donations from wealthy parents tied directly to his programs. But predators rarely looked dangerous. They looked safe. They looked perfect. And Shadow wasn't fooled. The following day, Ross stationed himself near Grayson's classroom between periods. He leaned casually against the wall, Shadow sitting obediently at his side, though the dog's gaze never left the door. Students filed in, chatting, laughing. Ross overheard snippets. "Grayson's the best. He wrote my recommendation letter. He's the reason I got that internship." It was all praise, all trust. Then the door opened and Grayson stepped into the hall. Shadow stiffened, growled deep in his chest. Grayson's smile flickered when his eyes met Ross's. "Still convinced your partner has something against me?" Grayson asked lightly. Ross held his gaze. "Dogs don't usually hold grudges." For a second, Grayson's expression hardened. Then the mask returned. "Well, maybe I should buy him a treat. Win him over." Shadow barked once, loud and sharp, the sound echoing off the lockers. Students glanced nervously, sensing tension even if they didn't understand it. Grayson adjusted his tie, smile never faltering. "Have a good day, officer." He disappeared back into his classroom, but Ross caught it. That flicker in his eyes again. Annoyance. Maybe fear. That night, Ross circled the east wing again with Shadow. The building was empty, the halls dark except for the hum of exit signs. Shadow led the way, nose to the ground, pulling harder as they neared the locked faculty room. The odor was stronger now. Ross crouched, pressing his hand against the wood. He swore he felt vibrations. Faint, rhythmic, like muffled movement. Shadow barked furiously, pawing at the door. Ross pulled the brass key he'd found in the utility closet days before. He slid it into the lock, heart pounding. It didn't turn. Wrong lock. But Shadow tugged him down the hall, nose pressed to the wall. He stopped at a narrow door almost hidden in shadow, a door Ross hadn't noticed before. He tried the key. This time it turned. The hinges groaned as he pushed it open. A rush of cold, stale air hit him. The smell of dust and mold mixed with that chemical sweetness. Shadow barked into the darkness, his voice echoing down a stairwell. Ross shone his flashlight. Stairs led downward into a basement Maplewood claimed didn't exist. Before he could move further, footsteps echoed from behind. Ross snapped the light off and pressed back against the wall. Principal Carter's voice cut through the silence. "Officer Ross, what are you doing?" Ross straightened, keeping his face neutral. "Just checking the perimeter." Carter's eyes flicked to the open door. His smile tightened. "That area is off limits. Unsafe. Please lock it back up." Ross hesitated, Shadow growled, low and unrelenting. Carter's voice hardened. "I'll say this plainly. You're a guest here. Stay within your role." Ross locked the door slowly, slipping the key back into his pocket. "Yes, sir," he said evenly. But as Carter walked away, Ross crouched beside Shadow. "We're not stopping. Not now." Shadow licked his hand once, tail wagging faintly, as if to say he understood. By Friday, the pressure was boiling. Students whispered louder. Teachers avoided eye contact, and Ross could feel the walls closing in. He stood outside Grayson's classroom as dismissal approached. Shadow sat beside him, calm but alert. When the final bell rang, Grayson stepped out, his smile broad as ever. "Officer Ross, still lurking in my hallway?" Ross's voice was steady. "Just making sure everyone's safe." Grayson leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You know, sometimes dogs bark at shadows, and sometimes men chase ghosts. Be careful what you think you're finding." Shadow barked, loud enough to make students jump. The sound reverberated, unshakable, undeniable. Ross didn't blink. "He's never wrong." For the first time, Grayson didn't smile. He turned on his heel and walked away, his shoulders tight, his charm slipping like a mask about to fall. Ross glanced down at Shadow. "We've got him, partner. We just have to prove it." The dog barked again, sharp and certain, echoing down the hall like a promise. By the time Saturday rolled around, the halls of Maplewood Prep were quiet. The students had gone home for the weekend. The parking lot stood nearly empty, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the tall oaks that lined the campus drive. For most people, the school's silence would have felt peaceful. To Officer Ross, it was the kind of silence that pressed on the ears, the kind that hid secrets. He parked his cruiser in the side lot, the one that backed up to the east wing. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, restless, his head shifting between the school and Ross. The German Shepherd's instincts were sharp enough to sense that today wasn't a routine patrol. Ross sipped the last of his lukewarm coffee, then patted the dog's flank. "All right, partner, let's find what they don't want us to see." The corridors of Maplewood felt different without the constant chatter of students. Every step echoed against the polished floor. Every door seemed taller, heavier. The sunlight from the windows stretched long across the halls, making the east wing look like a tunnel. Shadow's ears perked the moment they turned down that hallway. He pulled hard on the leash, nails skittering, until he reached the locked faculty room. As always, his nose pressed to the seam, his body vibrating with urgency. But this time, Ross didn't pull him back. Instead, Ross knelt by the smaller utility door he'd discovered days before. The one half hidden in shadow, almost disguised as part of the wall. He pulled the old brass key from his pocket. His thumb ran over the grooves once before he slid it into the lock. Click if one. The sound was louder than he expected in the empty hallway. Shadow barked once, sharp, ready. Ross pushed the door open. A gust of cold air hit him, carrying the smell of mold, dust, and that same faint sweetness that had haunted his nose all week. He flicked on his flashlight. A narrow stairwell stretched downward into the dark. "After you," Ross whispered, unclipping Shadow's leash. The dog trotted forward without hesitation, barking once before descending. The stairwell creaked with every step. The walls were lined with peeling paint, the air damp and heavy. As Ross followed Shadow down, he realized the steps were original, decades old, maybe from the school's founding. Maplewood had always boasted about its history, about the way the old merged with the new. But this history had been buried, hidden from sight. At the bottom, the hallway branched out into a series of rooms. Old storage spaces, filled with broken desks, rusted filing cabinets, and stacks of textbooks that smelled of mildew. Dust lay thick on everything, except for a trail of footprints pressed clearly into the grime. Ross crouched, his flashlight beam following the prints. They were fresh. Shadow growled low, head tilting toward the farthest door. His tail stiffened, hackles raised. Ross moved cautiously, gun holstered but ready. He pushed open the door. Inside was another storage space, but different. This one wasn't abandoned. The room had been cleared of dust, the floor swept clean. A metal storage cage stood against the far wall, heavy-duty padlock gleaming. And inside the cage, Ross's flashlight caught flashes of color. Belongings. A pink backpack with a keychain dangling, a pair of sneakers too small for any adult, a phone case decorated with stickers. Ross's chest tightened. Charlotte. He stepped closer, shining the beam higher. The cage held more. Other bags, other shoes, a jacket with initials stitched on the sleeve. And these weren't just Charlotte's things. They belonged to more than one student. Shadow barked violently, pawing at the cage. Ross tried the brass key, but it didn't fit. He cursed under his breath. His radio sat heavy on his shoulder. He could call it in, but Carter and the board would bury it before backup even arrived. He needed undeniable proof, something no one could ignore. "Easy, boy," Ross said, crouching beside Shadow. "We'll get it open." He scanned the room, spotting a crowbar leaning against the wall. He grabbed it, wedged it against the padlock, and shoved with all his weight. The metal groaned, resisted, then snapped. Shadow lunged forward, nose pressed to the belongings. He sniffed furiously, then barked again, turning toward the stack of crates in the corner. Ross shined the light. The crates looked ordinary, stacked too high, labels faded. But Shadow pawed hard, nails scraping wood. "Show me," Ross whispered. He pushed the crates aside. Behind them, in the narrow gap against the wall, something shifted. A muffled sound. A whimper. Ross froze. "Oh, God." He dropped to his knees, heart hammering. "Hello? Can you hear me?" The sound came again, a faint cry, desperate, choked. "Hang on," Ross said. He yanked the crates back farther, shoving them out of the way. His flashlight beam caught the outline of a small body, huddled, bound at the wrists and ankles, gagged with a strip of cloth. A boy, no older than 14. His eyes squinted against the light, terrified. Ross ripped the gag off. "You're safe now. I've got you." The boy coughed, voice hoarse. He locked me in here." "Who?" Ross demanded. The boy's lips trembled. "Mr. Grayson." Ross's blood ran cold. He cut the ropes quickly with his pocket knife, pulling the boy to his feet. Shadow pressed against the kid gently, nuzzling his hand, grounding him. "You're safe," Ross repeated, steady and calm. "You're getting out of here." The boy clung to Shadow's fur, trembling. Ross guided him up the stairs, flashlight beam bouncing against the walls. Every sound felt amplified. Their breathing, the creak of wood, the distant hum of the building above. He half expected Carter to be waiting at the top, smile sharpened into a blade. But the hallway was empty when they emerged. Ross hustled the boy to his cruiser, wrapping him in a blanket from the trunk. The kid shook violently, still too terrified to speak more. Ross crouched beside him, voice firm. "Listen to me. You're safe now. I need you to stay quiet until I can get you somewhere safe. Do you understand?" The boy nodded weakly, clutching Shadow's neck. Ross straightened, pulling out his phone. He needed to call this in, but carefully. Too many years in Maplewood would shut it down. He thought of Charlotte, of the belongings in the cage, of how long this had been going on under everyone's noses. He looked down at Shadow. The dog stared back, eyes sharp, steady. "You were right," Ross whispered. "You've been right from the start." Shadow barked once, as if to say the hunt wasn't over. Not yet. That night, Ross sat in his living room with the boy wrapped in blankets on the couch. Shadow curled protectively at his feet. The kid had finally spoken more, voice trembling. "He told me, He told me I had to stay quiet, that nobody would believe me. He said he'd done this before. Ross's stomach twisted. Charlotte? The boy's eyes filled with tears. He nodded slowly. She was here. She was here before me. Ross leaned back, fists clenched. The evidence was undeniable now. The cage, the belongings, the boy's testimony. But Grayson was still free, still smiling in his classroom, still adored by everyone. Shadow lifted his head, ears pricked, watching Ross. We're not done, Ross said quietly. Not until we bring him down. The boy shifted closer to Shadow, burying his face in the dog's fur. For the first time all week, Ross felt a spark of hope. They had a survivor. They had proof. Now they needed justice. The boy's confession gnawed at Ross long after midnight. He sat at his kitchen table, legal pad covered in notes, half-empty coffee cooling beside him. Across the room, the rescued kid slept on the couch, curled under a blanket, Shadow lying like a sentry at his feet. Every so often, the boy twitched in his sleep, mumbling, and Shadow nudged him gently with his nose, grounding him back into silence. Ross rubbed his eyes, exhaustion burning at the edges, but his mind wouldn't quit. A storage cage filled with belongings, a terrified boy whispering Charlotte's name, Grayson's mask slipping, even if only for a flicker, and the locked East Wing room, the center of everything. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. If Charlotte was alive, she had to be somewhere close. And if she wasn't, he cut the thought off before it could finish. He'd seen too many parents bury children. He wasn't letting that happen again. Shadow lifted his head, ears pricking. A low growl hummed in his chest. Ross looked over. You hear it too, don't you? We're not done. The dog barked once, sharp, decisive. By morning, Ross had arranged for the boy to be placed under protective watch, away from Maplewood, away from anyone who might silence him. The kid clung to Shadow before he left, whispering, "Thank you." Ross crouched, his voice low but firm. "You're safe now, but I need you to stay strong. Your story matters." With that settled, Ross drove straight back to the school. The campus gleamed in the autumn sunlight, as if nothing had changed. Parents dropped off students, teachers sipped coffee, laughter floated across the lawn. But Ross knew what lay underneath the polish. He parked near the East Wing again, heart pounding with the weight of what he planned. No more tiptoeing. He was going back down into that basement. The East Wing was quieter than ever, students avoiding it like the plague. Rumors had spread, dogs barking, doors rattling, whispers of ghosts in the walls. Ross moved quickly, Shadow at his side, head low and eyes alert. At the small hidden door, Ross slid the brass key into the lock. This time his hands didn't tremble. He knew what was waiting below. The stairwell groaned as they descended, dust swirling in the beam of his flashlight. Shadow padded forward, muscles taut, every sense alive. The footprints were still there, fresher now, like someone had come through after Ross the night before. His gut twisted. Someone knew he'd been here. They reached the storage cage again. The padlock Ross had snapped lay discarded on the floor, but the cage had been resecured with a new one, heavier, stronger. Inside, the belongings were still there, but the pink backpack was gone. The sneakers, too. Pieces were missing, removed. Ross's stomach turned cold. Someone was cleaning up. "Damn it," he muttered. Shadow growled, nose pressed against the bars. Then he pivoted suddenly, ears locked on the far corner of the basement. He barked furiously, tail rigid, body straining forward. Ross swung his flashlight. Against the wall, behind another stack of crates, was a second door. Smaller, metal, almost flush with the wall. Rust streaked its edges, but a new padlock gleamed. Ross's pulse hammered. He hadn't seen it before. He crouched, yanked at the lock. Solid. He tried the crowbar again, wedging it against the latch, muscles straining. Shadow barked beside him, as if urging him on. With a metallic crack, the lock snapped. Ross pushed the door open. The smell hit him instantly. Stale air, sweat, chemicals. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness. A narrow room stretched inside, concrete walls damp with age. And there in the corner, huddled against a mattress on the floor, was Charlotte Hale. She flinched at the light, hands shielding her face. Her hair was tangled, her uniform torn, her wrists bruised from rope. But her eyes were open, wide, terrified, and alive. "Charlotte," Ross said, voice breaking with relief. "It's okay. You're safe now. Shadow padded forward carefully, tail wagging low, ears relaxed. He sniffed the air, then pressed his nose gently against her hand. Charlotte sobbed, clutching his fur. Ross cut the ropes with his pocket knife, guiding her gently to her feet. "We're getting you out of here." She clung to him, voice barely a whisper. "He said no one would believe me. He said if I screamed, no one would hear." Ross swallowed hard. "You don't have to say another word right now. Just know you're safe." Shadow barked once, echoing through the room like a promise. They moved quickly back up the stairs, Ross half carrying Charlotte, Shadow leading the way. Every creak of the wood sounded like an alarm, every echo of their footsteps like a signal. As they reached the hallway, Ross froze. Principal Carter stood at the far end, arms crossed, expression tight. "Officer Ross," Carter said smoothly, "what exactly do you think you're doing?" Ross straightened, shielding Charlotte behind him. "Rescuing a child your school pretended wasn't missing." Carter's jaw flexed. "You have no right." "I have every right," Ross snapped, "and you know it." Shadow growled, teeth bared, stance forward. Carter paled but didn't move. Ross guided Charlotte down the hall past Carter, daring him to stop them. The principal didn't. His smile cracked for the first time, revealing something uglier underneath. Back at the cruiser, Ross wrapped Charlotte in a blanket, handing her a bottle of water. She shook, tears streaking her face, but relief flickered in her eyes. Shadow pressed close, resting his head on her lap. She clutched him tightly. He told me it was just tutoring. Then he locked the door. I couldn't get out. He kept coming back." Ross's throat tightened. He forced his voice steady. "It's over now. You're safe. We'll make sure he never touches anyone again." Her eyes darted up, fear still sharp. "He'll come for me. He said he always does." Ross clenched his fists. "Not anymore." That night, Ross filed his report with the department, every detail written carefully, the evidence undeniable. But even as he finished, he knew the hardest part was still ahead. Maplewood's board would fight, Carter would maneuver, and Grayson would smile like he always did. But Ross had what they couldn't erase: a survivor, witness testimony, physical evidence, and a dog whose instincts had led straight to the truth. He leaned back in his chair, exhausted. Shadow lay at his feet, chest rising steadily, eyes half closed but alert even in rest. Ross reached down, scratching behind his ear. "We did it, partner, but we're not finished." Shadow thumped his tail as if to agree. The next morning, news hadn't broken yet. The school buzzed as usual, parents waving from expensive cars, students clutching coffee cups and laughing about weekend plans. But beneath the surface, the truth waited. Ross stood near the east wing, Shadow at his side. Grayson passed down the hall, smiling as always, nodding to students, shaking hands with parents. But this time, Ross didn't look away. He stepped into the teacher's path. "We need to talk," Ross said evenly. Grayson's smile flickered. For the first time, his eyes betrayed him. Just for a second. Fear. Then the mask returned. "Of course, officer. Anything for the school." Shadow growled, deep and certain, the sound rolling down the hallway like thunder. Ross didn't blink. "It's over. You just don't know it yet." The morning assembly at Maplewood Prep was supposed to be a celebration. Parents packed the auditorium, dressed sharp as if attending a gala, while students sat in neat rows, uniforms crisp and polished. The stage glowed with warm light, banners draped high above. Principal Carter stood at the podium, smiling as if nothing in the world could disturb the shine of his perfect school. "Welcome," he began smoothly, "to another day of excellence at Maplewood Preparatory Academy, where tradition, discipline, and achievement guide every student to greatness." Polite applause filled the room. Parents clapped, teachers smiled, cameras clicked. It was the same performance Maplewood had delivered for decades. But beneath the gloss, Shadow stirred. At the back of the room, Officer Daniel Ross stood with Shadow, the German Shepherd poised and alert. Ross's eyes scanned the crowd, his jaw tight. In his pocket was the evidence: the photos of the basement, the testimony of the rescued boy, Charlotte's belongings. But what mattered most wasn't in his pocket. It was right outside, protected by officers Ross had called in overnight. Charlotte Hale and the other survivor were safe now. Safe because Shadow had refused to stop barking. Ross's gaze shifted to Mr. Grayson, seated near the front, smiling, shaking hands with parents, nodding to students who beamed back at him. He looked flawless, suit pressed, tie perfect, posture confident. But Ross saw it, that flicker of fear when Shadow's growl cut through the polished silence. And it came now. Shadow stood, hackles raised and barked. Loud, powerful, echoing through the auditorium. Heads turned, murmurs rippled. The dog barked again, paw forward, teeth bared, every ounce of his body aimed at Grayson. Carter cleared his throat at the podium, voice strained. Ladies and gentlemen, please ignore the... Ross's voice cut sharp. No one ignore him. The room froze. Ross strode down the aisle, Shadow at his side, barking with the weight of urgency that no one could dismiss anymore. Students gasped, parents whispered, cameras snapped. Ross stopped at the front, just feet from Grayson. Mr. Grayson, Ross said, voice carrying through the hushed crowd. Stand up. Grayson laughed softly, shaking his head. Officer, this is absurd. A dog barks and suddenly I'm... Stand up, Ross repeated, steel in his tone. Grayson rose slowly, still smiling, but sweat had broken at his temples. Ross turned to the crowd. For days, this dog has been trying to tell us something. He barked at the East Wing. He barked at the locked room. He barked at this man. And every time we were told to ignore him, to protect the image of this school. Parents shifted uneasily, murmuring. Carter's face paled at the podium. Ross pulled a folder from his jacket, raising it high. Inside the East Wing basement, we found a locked cage filled with student belongings. We found a terrified boy, alive, who told us who put him there. And last night we found Charlotte Hale. Gasps erupted across the room. Charlotte's parents stood, hands to their mouths, tears streaming. She's alive, Ross continued firmly. She's safe. And she told me the same thing the boy did, that Mr. Grayson lured them, trapped them, abused their trust. The auditorium erupted. Shouts, cries, disbelief. Some parents screamed. Students stared in horror, their beloved teacher suddenly unrecognizable. Grayson's mask cracked at last. His smile vanished, eyes darting for escape. Shadow lunged forward, barking so violently the sound seemed to shake the walls. Officers surged in from the back doors, weapons ready. Thomas Grayson, Ross said, his voice like stone. You're under arrest. Grayson bolted for the side door, but Shadow was faster. The German Shepherd lunged, teeth snapping into the fabric of Grayson's sleeve, yanking him down hard. Grayson hit the floor with a shout, struggling, but Shadow held firm, growling, pinning him until officers swarmed. Handcuffs clicked, the sound final, sealing the end of Grayson's reign of deception. The auditorium roared, shock, relief, chaos. Parents clutched their children. Teachers wept. Students stared, some unable to believe what they had seen. Ross knelt beside Shadow, hand on his fur. Good boy, you did it. The dog's eyes burned steady, chest heaving, tail wagging once before settling back into his calm, watchful stance. Hours later, the sun was higher, casting warm light across Maplewood's front lawn. News vans lined the gates, cameras rolling, reporters shouting questions. But the only image that mattered was Charlotte, stepping carefully from a patrol car, wrapped in a blanket, into her mother's arms. The sobs that followed carried louder than any headline could. Ross stood back, Shadow at his side. He didn't need the spotlight. The hero was already beside him, tail wagging softly, ears pricked. Students walked past, some stopping to pet Shadow, whispering thank you with trembling voices. Principal Carter had disappeared into silence, the board scrambling to contain the fallout. But Ross didn't care. The truth was out. The image was shattered. What mattered was that children were safe. That night, Ross sat on his porch with Shadow stretched across the steps, both of them bone-tired but restless. The town was buzzing, the news spreading, the community shaken to its core. Ross scratched Shadow's ear. You never gave up, did you? Everyone else laughed it off, ignored it, pushed it aside. But you knew. Shadow sighed, laying his head on Ross's boot, content. Ross leaned back, staring at the dark sky. Sometimes it takes a dog to make people listen. He thought of the students who would return to school next week, shaken but safer. He thought of Charlotte's tears in her mother's arms. He thought of how easily it all could have stayed hidden, if not for Shadow's persistence. Justice wasn't always swift, but sometimes it barked until the world finally stopped and listened. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. Shadow reminded us that instincts matter, that sometimes the smallest signals carry the loudest truths. Now I'd like to ask you, would you have trusted the dog when no one else did?